Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War Warhammer 2 Quick Match gameplay. This time around we are doing a little bit of Dark Elf against Empire gameplay. So right off the bat I do want to say I hope everyone had a great holiday. That's the reason I took a bit of a hiatus from putting up a few videos for the past few days. But now back to schedule, and I should be posting regularly from now on until further notice. So definitely hope everyone's holiday was great, and this kind of decided to run this sort of game for just fun, there's no build in particular I'm going for here. I didn't want to try out the Hydra in a quick match, but other than that there wasn't much specific I was going for, so I did decide for my Lord to take Malekith on a dragon, which I think is a little bit of a risk. Generally taking flying lords against Empire, if you can't completely overwhelm their shooting, is a bit of a risk, just because Empire can just bring nets and shoot you down. But I decided to try it out anyway. I do have Gaze of Malice, so I'm hoping that can help me disrupt enemy shooting. I did bring Soul Stealer for the heals, good old Chillwind just for a little bit of extra damage, and then Power of Darkness just to hopefully improve my power reserves and power recharge rate. Of course he does have Standard Ground, he does have the usual Noxious Breath, and he does debuff enemy armor with Spiteful Conjuration when he's casting. Of course he does cause fear, terror, all that good stuff, and it actually does appear that he has a built-in physical resist of 20%, which is pretty awesome. It makes him actually very, very tanky, between 25% missile resist, 20% physical resist, 80 armor. He's pretty survivable against a lot of shooting. Then, on the ground, we do have, for our front line, we do have our Black Arc Corsairs. We didn't bring any heroes, but Black Arc Corsairs are a pretty decent anti-Empire, in my opinion, anti-Empire infantry unit. Their weapon strength is a little lackluster at only 28, but they do have a little bonus against infantry of 7. And against the vast majority of the Empire front line, these guys will have a lot of armor. They have 80 armor, so against the vast majority of what Empire can bring on the ground, whether that be flagellants, swordsmen, spearmen, all that sort of stuff, these guys will perform very, very effectively against them. They also don't have the worst of melee defense or melee attack, so in baseline, so they're just very competitive. Plus they have 40 speed, so if you manage to break the enemy's front line, you can push through and wreak out some havoc. Now, in the second line, I do have a War Hydra. Now, the Hydra is a little bit of an iffy pick. It's not usually the most popular in quick match, but I did want to give it a shot. I figured it does actually have pretty cool. It has actually a pretty high missile resistance of 35%. It's crazy fast regen, and it does have an ability, Another Takes Its Place, which can activate up to 3 times when its HP drops below 50%, and it gives you a massive burst of healing. You also do have Fire Breath, but this is a little bit of a iffy ability. It fires in a straight line, and so a lot of times you can't really get a very effective cast of it. Nonetheless, still cool to have. Its melee attack is very high, it has armor piercing damage, but its armor is rather pitiful. Its HP pool is only 7,000, and melee defense is terrible. So against even spearmen, this will do fairly poorly, just holding up, unless you can tear out them. Behind that, though, I do have the Black Guard of Nagaron. My hope originally was kind of to put the Black Guard of Nagaron underneath the War Hydra and just use them to kind of defend the War Hydra from anti-large, while the War Hydra causes terror and armor piercing and all that good stuff. Finally, in the back, I do have Witch Elves, and of course Witch Elves do have Frenzy, and more importantly though, they have that Madness of Cain, which is pretty awesome. It will hopefully let me kind of root a unit down in place and just chop them to bits, especially if I can catch, say, cavalry units like Bloralt of Grifffites and then pull in the Black Guard of Nagaron. Black Guard of Nagaron is of course immune to psychology, then we can kind of tag team them and absolutely annihilate them while they're rampaging. Finally, we do have 2 units of Shades with Greatswords out here on the flank. That is to get me the most competitive, really, melee option. These guys are really there to chop up enemy Greatswords, enemy heavy cavalry, because I don't have too many options against them. Otherwise, just focus out units of priority. For my opponent, he did decide to go rather wide, and I think this is a relatively effective build against Dark Elves in a lot of ways. For his Lord, he did bring a General of the Empire, which is the only really iffy pick here, I think. General of the Empire is not really common anymore, ever since he lost his Potion of Toughness. That said, he does have a Rune Fang, which is interesting. It's just a kind of vanilla Rune Fang, which just boosts his melee damage all over. Pretty cool ability on a fairly long cooldown, though. Stand Your Ground, of course, and Charmed Shield, which is a great little survivability a talent for himself. He also does a Blood Roar, which is -8 leadership debuff when he's in melee, which, stacked on top of the fact that he causes fear and terror on his Griffin, means this guy can actually rout units that aren't immune to psychology very, very, very effectively. There's just no getting around it. Then, on the ground, he does have a Lore of Light Wizard with the Net of Mintok, and it actually does look like he didn't really bring anything else on the Lore of Light Wizard. He did bring a Power Stone for extra Winds of Magic, and he did bring Channeling Staff for reduced ability recharge time, which is a little interesting. In my opinion, this isn't really a worthwhile ability when you're just bringing that, but nonetheless, pretty cool, and definitely, I gotta watch out for it. On the ground, he does have a front line that's very, very unbreakable, mix of flagellants and swordsmen. Swordsmen, I suppose, are rather breakable, but the 2 units of flagellants should be pretty survivable, and just waste my time as I have to chop through them. Behind that, he does have a single unit of handgunners on this flank, and then of course the silver bullets, which are almost a must pick. It's a little unfortunate, honestly, but the silver bullets are basically a must-have in almost any Empire composition. They're just very, very powerful with their stalk and armor piercing. Behind that, 3 units of greatswords can really dice up a lot of my higher end infantry, and just solid choices. They'll definitely tear through Blackguard Corsairs and Witch Elves. The only unit they'll struggle a bit against is Blackguard, which will probably beat them in a 1-to-1. And that my opponent does have some spearmen just for additional chaff, sort of covering the flanks, covering the back. He does have the hammer of witches in the very back, which can do some nasty damage. So definitely that was a little bit of a long intro. Unfortunately, I do definitely apologize for that, guys. You can see my War Hydra immediately getting kind of annihilated between the handguns and the cannons. It's already lost about 2,000 HP. The Hammer of Witches actually got altered recently, or in the Mortal Empires. It used to have a bonus against large and actually do fairly pitiful, normal cannon damage otherwise, but now it actually just does monstrous damage all over. Pretty crazy. You can see I'm just trying to push the War Hydra in, and there's no real way I can kind of protect it. It's just going to take massive fire no matter what I do. But I do get a little bit of fire attack here on the greatswords, but you can see it only picks off 2 models, and it kind of roasted the edge of the unit, so it was very, very iffy. But now I'm kind of committing my good old Blackguard Corsairs into the fight, and they should dice up these swordsmen pretty effectively, and these flagellants. Which also I'm kind of keeping in the reserve for a little bit, and now I'm ordering my shades to attack these greatswords. You can see Gaze of Malice go down, the handgunners knocking them about, and these greatswords are going down like 9 pins against that shade fire. The shades are very, very potent against heavily armored units like greatswords. They have amazing DPS at 34. They actually don't do more damage per shot than Dark Shards, but they just shoot a lot faster. I'm now committing my Witch Elves, just tears through the flagellants as quickly as possible. Witch Elves, of course, are very, very powerful against lightly armored troops, and they will dice through these guys rather quickly and hopefully help me just mop these guys up and force a breach. In the meantime, my poor War Hydra is already routed, but it is at 3,400 HP, and now Malekith does get hit with a net of Mintok, which is a huge problem. I do manage to breath these Zintler's Reichsguard, though, and I will shortly thereafter cast a Soul Stealer, which should hopefully help heal Malekith at least a tiny bit. You can also see the swordsmen are collapsing against the Blackguard Corsairs, who are just very, very powerful and just absolutely annihilating them. Now here on the ground, the Blackguard Corsairs are not doing well against Zintler's Reichsguard, which is to be expected because Zintler's Reichsguard has monstrous armor. You can see though, I'm trying to get a little bit of chill wind that does deal with their armor a little bit, but nonetheless these guys are just monstrous in comparison to the poor Blackguard Corsairs. Now I do make a huge mistake here though. I take Malekith and I was hoping to tear out these greatswords, so I land him on the ground, thinking took my attention away, knowing that my Witch Elves has gotten on top of my opponent's silver bullets. In the meantime, my opponent still has these handguns online, and his general does dive in and goes after Malekith. And the general is going to annihilate poor Malekith. He won't be able to get away. These Blackguard Corsairs are down here, and the Blackguard is over on the wrong flank. Fortunately for my opponent, though, the Hydra has recovered, and the shades are absolutely annihilating these greatswords. You can see they're being focused down very heavily, and they're basically just going to rout. Over here, the Witch Elves have gotten into the chicken coop, and they are absolutely tearing through my opponent's backline. Spears, handguns, silver bullets, all getting torn up by a single unit of Witch Elves. You can see they've jumped from 56 to over 70, almost 80. There we go, 80 kills in the space of a few seconds. Witch Elves are just monsters against lightly armored infantry like this. Over here, Blackguard Corsairs are pinstering this unit of spearmen, and with their charge, they are completely tearing them a new one. Over here, there's the only flank where things are kind of going a little shady, and the greatswords are definitely taking on the Blackguard Corsairs very, very effectively. Fortunately for my opponent, though, his general does kind of get caught in the middle of the Blackguard after fighting Malekith. Who actually did go. I do believe, actually, no, Malekith actually escaped. He simply routed off and fled off the field. But you can see the shades really, really beat up on the general, and of course he has no way of healing himself. Meantime, these greatswords are kind of folding between to the pincering damage of the 2 units of Blackguard Corsairs. Greatswords don't have the best of melee stats, unfortunately for them. So they generally take hits. Their main line of defense is really their armor. Fortunately for me, though, you can see my opponent just land a lovely, his Hammer Witch is just mauling my great shades over here, and he lands a lovely net, and he gets a full charge in with Zintler's Reichsguard. Fortunately for him, though, my shades here are the ones with the great weapons, so they would still tear through Zintler's Reichsguard pretty effectively in a drawn-out conflict. Fortunately for me, though, Blackguard does get netted as they're trying to come back, and so the Zintler's Reichsguard sneaks away just fine. For the General of the Empire has dove down upon my poor Blackguard Corsairs, and is definitely kind of making him rout and run amok. At the same time, though, in my opponent's backline, things are looking very bad with the silver bullets being shattered, the handguns over here routing, and my opponent does decide to throw in the towel at this point, as my Corsairs are kind of running ham on the backline. Now, as you can see, Blackguard Corsairs in general, except for those that got caught up against the Great Swords or Zintler's Reichsguard, performed very, very well. Actually, I do believe these were the only ones who got caught up against Zintler's Reichsguard, and of course they did rather pitifully. But against all the other Empire units, Blackguard Corsairs are very, very potent. They're definitely not a match for Great Swords, and should not be expected to beat them in a 1v1, or they'll even struggle 2v1 unless you get a nice pincer. But nonetheless, they're very good against the vast majority of the Empire infantry roster, and they're very quick on their feet. They can gap close, and if your opponent does decide to go a little skinny, you can definitely pincer. And I was trying to do that game by just outflanking, but I did get intercepted by one of my opponent's swordsman units. Now, as of for the rest of this build, Witch Elf is absolutely brutal. If you can get him into the chicken coop like I did there, my opponent's handgun line wasn't firing at him at all because they were too focused on Malekith. Once they got into the chicken coop, once they got on top of the handguns and the spearmen, it was game over. The Witch Elves just tore him a new one, and you can see 100, almost 180 kills on the Witch Elves. Absolutely monstrous performance. They're a very, very potent unit. They're like War Dancers, except unlike War Dancers, they can force your opponent to stand and fight you thanks to their Madness of Cain ability, and that is just very, very brutal for poor melee units like the, or units that are really poor in melee like the handguns. And I think Witch Elves are almost another one of those units that's almost a must pick in a Dark Elf composition. You don't have to, you can definitely work around it, but their Madness of Cain ability is just such a flexible ability. It lets you root enemy units in place if you don't want them flanking. It lets you, if you get into the backline, they will devastate the backline. Plus, they're fast enough to do it. If your opponent doesn't focus them very hard with shooting, they can get into the backline and they will pin down the enemy shooting and tear it to shreds. And if your enemy has cavalry, they can tie down the cavalry potentially and allow your anti-large units to tear them apart. So there's a lot of sort of usage for the Witch Elves, and they're very, very potent in that sense. Blackguard Nagaron performed rather well. I was definitely not disappointed. They're very powerful unit in general. Immunity psychology is huge for them. And I think they're just a very, very potent unit in general. They definitely tore through the general Empire. I did definitely committed them a little late. I should have committed them earlier alongside the Hydra, and that definitely cost me the Hydra, at least early on. Of course, the Hydra did recover, but it meant that the Hydra routed off fairly early on. Otherwise, they performed fairly well. Blackguard will outtrade Great Swords in a 1-to-1. They are obviously more expensive, but their stats are just so high that they will outtrade Great Swords. Finally, Shades really give you that little bit of extra armor-piercing oomph that this sort of build otherwise lacks. Blackguard Corsairs and the Witch Elves really don't have much armor-piercing oomph. There's only one unit of Blackguard, and Shades with Great Swords can actually perform really well in melee. They've got a decent charge bonus for shooting infantry, and they've got very, very potent range damage. And at the same time, they're rather survivable. Empire can often bring a very powerful shooting line. And these guys are obviously stalked. They have stalks, so they're somewhat survivable against that. And they're very potent in melee. If your opponent gets heavy cav into them, they will still dish out a lot of hurt to heavy cav. If your opponent has heavy infantry, you can actually use these guys in melee against heavy infantry if needed, if push comes to shove in the late game. So they're just a very, very potent unit in a variety of ways. In that early game, they performed very well at just shutting down those great swords, giving me an early edge and a breach in the center through which the Witch Elves could then stream and delete my opponent's middle. Finally, of course, War Hydra was a bit of an iffy pick. It got shot down very heavily by the Hammer of Witches, which is basically optimized for killing units like this. I don't think the War Hydra is really an optimal unit to bring. It's rather slow. In spite of its missile resistance, its low armor, and really poor melee defense, makes it pretty susceptible to taking damage. Outside of the regen, it's just a very, very vulnerable unit. And I'm not the biggest fan of the War Hydra in general, but I did want to give it a shot, just try it out. So yeah, there weren't any crazy breath attacks that got off or anything like that, so there wasn't much to say for it. Finally, Malekith, of course, did perform somewhat poorly. He got caught and shut down really hard by enemy shooting. It was a bit of a risk bringing him on the dragon, but even if I hadn't, he still did some good damage. He disrupted my opponent's backline, and that mattered with his spells, and that mattered for a little bit. And otherwise, he's not a bad lord, but I definitely made some mistakes with how I deployed him and how I utilized him, and it cost me him rather early on, which is definitely unfortunate. For my opponent, there are a very small handful of iffy picks here that I would point out. The General of the Empire, I think, is not really a worthwhile choice if you're playing as Empire. I think you're better off bringing either Boris or bringing Volkmar, or bringing, if you really want to bring a kind of a combat general and you're willing to sacrifice healing, then Karl Franz is a better pick, in my opinion. Even Balthazar Geld would be better. I think General of the Empire just right now, it just lacks the oomph. His stats are fairly pitiful. He doesn't really have any particularly special abilities going for him, and he doesn't have regen, so there's nothing going from there either. If you bring a Lore of Life Wizard, you can be a little more survivable, but in that situation, I'd probably just bring Karl Franz. For my opponents, the rest of my opponent's force, pretty decent, I think, if you're dealing with sort of lower-end chaff infantry from Dark Elves. I definitely think either bringing more great swords, more shooting, or ideally more heavy cavalry is a good idea. Dark Elves are pretty susceptible to that sort of stuff. You definitely want, against Dark Elves, you definitely need either to bring some decent amount of handguns to tear through their basically handgun / outriders against the Black Guard, backed by some sort of heavy cavalry. You definitely need, I think, those two things against Dark Elves if you're playing as Empire. So this was a very wide front line, which was rather functional, but it could have definitely been a tiny bit shorter and make perhaps a little bit of room for for an extra unit of handguns, perhaps. Zintler's Reichsguard, another bit of an interesting pick. I think regular Reichsguard would have been just fine. Zintler's Reichsguard is a bit of a niche pick. It just gives you Vanguard and immunity to psychology, and they're almost as expensive as Demigriffs with halberds. So if you're doing this, you might as well go for the whole hog, I think, and take Demigriffs with halberds. Probably downgraded the great swords and brought Demigriffs with halberds instead of Zintler's Reichsguard. And then finally, Herald Witch is not a terrible pick, I think, especially the way my opponent deployed, but once again, I think there's better investments. You can definitely bring 2 units of handguns, for example, instead of single hammer witches. But other than that, I think this is I definitely think it's an all-over decent build, and definitely great game to my opponent. Even Special Forces here. So I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. It was a bit of a long one, and I'm definitely feeling a little chatty because I haven't done one of these in a little while now. Definitely I'll be trying to put up some additional, keep putting up gameplay, keep putting up all that sort of stuff. Keep putting up gameplay, keep putting up tutorials and Sanctus Reach stuff and all that. And I definitely actually have a few Sanctus Reach videos I need to put up at some point. Yeah. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below to keep up with additional content. Any comments, criticism, any questions about the game or anything like that, be sure to post them down in the comments. And as usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.